how's your sermon going? My husband asked me earlier this week. I haven't started it yet, I told him. What are you preaching about, he asked. Awe. Well, that's easy, he replied. You can talk about your husband. I just might do that, I told him. Awe is among the most ancient of human, if not always marital, experiences. We have depicted it, told stories, sung songs, created art, and built monuments to it for thousands and thousands of years. The word we use for it in this time and place, awe, is borrowed not from Greek or Latin, like so many concepts we delve into on these Sunday mornings, but from early Scandinavian. It's related to the old Icelandic word for terror, dread, uproar, and respect. Did you know that? Interesting, right? I didn't know about the Icelandic. We use awe pretty casually sometimes, as in, I am awed by your ability to make friends, or I am awed by how much oatmeal you can eat in one sitting. I am talking about my husband now. On both counts. You're welcome, honey. But another kind of awe, big awe, is not casual. It's a profound feeling. The adjective awesome, which we also use casually, it contains the word awe, and in its classic sense, it refers to something that fills somebody with reverential fear, wonder, or respect. The awesome roar of an African lion heard from a safe distance. The word awful also contains awe, and it refers to that which inspires or instills fear, terror, or dread, something that's terrible or distressing, maybe that same roar, much closer. The feeling of fear is the link here in these concepts. Psychology researchers Dr. Keltner and Jonathan Haidt locate awe in the upper reaches of pleasure and on the boundary of fear. Awe, when it is profoundly experienced, is both pleasant and it's also connected on some level with a sort of fear response, but in a good way most of the time. Last month, I had the opportunity to see an exhibit of works by the artist Judy Chicago. It was at UNM's Harwood Museum up in Taos. For anybody who doesn't know, Judy Chicago is a famous artist and an author whose career has spanned at least a half century now. Early on, she observed that there was very, very little birth iconography in the male-dominated history of Western art, like practically none. If you look around at the famous historical artworks on display in museums, you just really don't see birth. This seemed strange since we all come into the world that way. Should be a rich topic, right? I mean, what's with all that art about living and dying and nothing about being born? And the fruit. This week a man duct taped a banana to a canvas, right? And made $120,000. That happened. So Judy Chicago started something that she calls the Birth Project. For 5 years in the 1980s, she designed a series of birth and creation images for needlework, and then she hired women needleworkers all around the country to make these pieces. And the artisans stitched, knotted, and crocheted the works of art Chicago had designed. The exhibit I saw last month was made up of works from the Birth Project. They are incredible, and I recommend them if you ever have a chance to experience them personally. The exhibit that I saw in Taos is over, but many of the works from the Birth Project actually reside just a few miles from our church at the Albuquerque Museum. They're not always on display, but they are there for exhibition and study. Most of the pieces I saw up in Taos were of a size that a person could pick up and hold, or maybe you could do it with one other person. But then I went around a corner and there appeared one big room, probably as deep as this sanctuary. and on the back wall hung a huge piece. It's 7 feet tall and 18 feet wide. It's crocheted in the style of lace. But instead of depicting flowers or other traditional lace patterns, this giant crocheted panel, done all in black, portrays birth. It portrays birth almost like a river coursing through a huge female form. She almost fills the entire panel with her body, and she has fingers and toes that turn into these rays. It's almost like creation energy is flowing toward her and through her and from her. It's hard to describe what it felt like to stand before this work of art. In that moment, I found it hard to speak. I was struck by the scale of it, by its nearly mystical depiction of the inner experience of giving birth, while simultaneously being iconographic, very outward. It wasn't just about birth, but it seemed to be about powerfulness and powerlessness, and about the source of existence itself. Looking at it, I immediately grasped what it means that this kind of iconography was missing for so long from the Western world, and what that has meant for women and for all of us. It also took me back instantly to my own experience of giving birth, which felt to me like balancing exactly on the edge between life and death. In the Harwood Museum that day, my heart raced to stand in front of that work of art, a feeling something like fear. And at the same time, I felt so much pleasure in the power and transcendence of it. I experienced awe. By the way, it feels really radical to speak from the pulpit about having experienced childbirth. To speak of it even in these vaguest terms feels like breaking a taboo of some sort, even though every single one of us was born. And that is one of the impacts of the absence of this iconography. We think of birth as unspeakable rather than as something universal and powerful. In the text version of this sermon on the church website, I'm going to include a link to an online image of that Judy Chicago work for anybody who's curious about it. Some experiences of awe are transformative, and others are more mundane. I think what's true is we can experience awe on a sort of continuum. On one side is awe about something not too big, but something we can't explain, like maybe that Peloton bike commercial. You can Google it later if you don't know what I'm talking about. Moving along the spectrum, we might feel a sense of awe at how beautiful a certain flower is. We feel wonder at nature's capacity for creativity, intricacy, diversity, beauty, and cleverness. You know, like the way goldenrod and asters grow side by side, so that their bright yellow and purple combine to look irresistibly beautiful to bees in a way that neither color could do alone. And it works on people too. It's what drew the plant biologist Robin Wall Kimmerer into her field of study, where she figured out their trick and wrote a beautiful essay about this thing. Next along the awe spectrum, perhaps something like witnessing a young human's first steps or first words. Those kinds of things are familiar to us, and yet they seem miraculous. We get that feeling of the heart soaring, and it's hard to describe all that it means to us. We're moving toward the ineffable now, things that leave us speechless. And that's where we might experience things that really take us out of our usual mode of consciousness. These are experiences of transformative awe. We might be deeply moved and changed, either a little bit or a lot, by something like a work of art, or hearing an amazing piece of music, or spending time on a mountain, or in the company of whales, or witnessing an incredible act of generosity. Transformative awe can be prompted by new information, such as physics revealing that the universe is expanding, and it's accelerating, and its acceleration is accelerating. I think the physicist Albert Einstein was embracing the wide possibilities for awe when he said, "There are only two ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle. The other is as though everything is a miracle. Transformative awe quiets the ego, and it awakens us to something profound. Where fear is part of awe, it's often because something is unknowable, unexplainable, or especially because it makes us realize how small we are. The Buddhist teacher Roshi Joan Halifax says that when we experience awe, it's often also an experience of threat to our egos. The ego is deconstructed a little or a lot when we experience awe. Researchers have been curious about the effects of awe in people's lives and in society. And the Greater Good Science Center at University of California at Berkeley has been the home to some of this research work. You can find a lot of talks and articles about it on their website. Studies show that experiencing awe increases people's feelings of connectedness. It increases humility, leads to increased sharing and a willingness to help or even sacrifice for others. It leads people to feel less narcissistic and entitled and more attuned to the common humanity that people share with each other. Fleeting experiences of awe, even simple ones like spending time among tall trees or listening to the sandhill cranes moving through the Bosque del Apache, these experiences reset people and they orient us toward each other and toward our collective good. Keltner and another researcher, Paul Piff, write, "You could make the case that our culture today is awe-deprived. Adults spend more and more time working and commuting and less time outdoors and with other people. Camping trips, picnics, and midnight skies are foregone in favor of working weekends and late at night. Attendance at art events like live music, theater, museums, and galleries has dropped over the years. This goes for children too," they write. "Arts and music programs in schools are being dismantled in lieu of programs better suited to standardized testing, time outdoors for novel, unbounded exploration are sacrificed for resume-building activities." The researchers draw a connection between this and the increasing individualism, materialism, and disconnection in our country. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote, "We can never sneer at the stars. We can never sneer at the stars or mock the dawn or scoff at the totality of being. Sublime grandeur evokes unhesitating, unflinching awe. Away from the immense, cloistered in our own concepts, we may scorn and revile everything. But standing between earth and sky, we are silenced." Standing between earth and sky, or suspended between the sidewalk and the twilight, as Ellen Bass put it in this morning's reading. We are silenced there in awe. We could use more of that kind of silence and less scorn and reviling, more connectedness and less sneering, more willingness to help and less mocking. It's a hard time to be human. We know too much and too little, said the poet. The experience of awe contains spiritual medicine for our times. And by spiritual, I don't mean supernatural. I mean deep, the depth aspect of being. Spirituality has to do with intangible things like love and belonging, and spirituality especially has to do with your sense of meaning in life and with your relationship with your fellow humans. It does not need to be supernatural, but because awe is a spiritual experience and it affects personal change, it is definitely prominent in the world's religious texts. One of the oldest examples of awe in a religious text can be found in the Bhagavad Gita, in a story about two branches of a royal family who are fighting with each other for control of the kingdom. The story's protagonist is Arjuna, and just as he's about to lead his troops into a huge battle, he completely loses his nerve. The deity Krishna tries to change his mind. He lectures Arjuna about duty. He tells him about the workings of the universe, and Arjuna is not persuaded. But then Krishna grants Arjuna a cosmic eye, with which he can perceive God and all the workings of the universe for himself. As those researchers Haidt and Keltner retell it, Arjuna sees gods, suns, and infinite time and space. He's filled with amazement. His hair stands on end. Disoriented, he struggles to describe the wonders he's beholding. Arjuna is clearly in a state of awe when he says, "Things never seen before have I seen, and ecstatic is my joy, yet fear and trembling perturb my mind." Transformed, Arjuna devotes himself to Krishna, and from then on follows what Krishna tells him. The Hebrew and Christian scriptures also contain many stories and references to awe. As Paul and the apostles gather converts together in the first Christian communities, the scripture says everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed. The scriptures refer to situations where we can reasonably expect awe was a component, like Moses ascending a mountain to converse with God, or a group of strong, experienced soldiers watching as a scrawny young boy, David, wearing no armor because it's all too big for him, defeats the terrifyingly large and strong Goliath using only a slingshot. Sometimes experiences of awe are translated in the scriptures with words like amazed, astonished, reverence, wonder, or fear. Psalm 111 describes the glorious and majestic works and the graciousness and compassion of God, and then it ends by saying, "Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom." And the same Hebrew word that's translated there as fear is used elsewhere as a synonym for love. So one might also translate this psalm to say, awe toward the source of all being is the beginning of wisdom. And that would be a beautifully liberal take on the psalm. But if you feel uncomfortable with stories about a powerful God that wins submission from someone by awing them, you're not wrong. You are paying attention to something important. In real life, awe is sometimes used by those in power to manipulate others or to maintain their power. A charismatic religious or political leader who draws thousands to a service or a rally often elicits awe, which may then be used for good or for harm. The phrase shock and awe comes to mind too, a military strategy in which one side deploys an extraordinary amount of force in order to leave the other side frozen and with no will to fight. So awe can be used to manipulate. So what do we do about that? Can we trust awe? Keltner and Haight say that there are two central themes among awe experiences. One is a sense of vastness, which can be experienced as grandeur or power. And the other is something they call accommodation, meaning our mental structures, the way we think, have to adjust in order to make sense of the thing that caused that awe in us in the first place. And it's that second part, changing the way we think, where we certainly have some agency. We can choose what to make of our experiences, right? We don't have to follow along unthinkingly. The other day I was listening to an interview between the novelist Marilynne Robinson and the physicist Marcelo Gleiser. They had discussed lots of awe-inspiring things in this conversation. And then while they were speaking of the value of religious stories relative to the value of science, Gleiser, the physicist, said, "Well, once you adopt that there's only one way of understanding the complexity of things, you're just emptying humanity of its value, of the plurality of visions." And so, yes, he said, science is powerful, but there are other ways of knowing. And to say there's only one way of understanding the mind is just silly, to be honest. It is impoverishing the richness of human culture. Gleiser is saying that they offer complementary, not necessarily contradictory modes of understanding the world and our lives if we use them right. This is also relevant to adjusting our thinking wisely when we have experienced awe. In being open to many sources of awe and bringing it to diverse ways of understanding, we engage the depth aspect of being, the life of the Spirit in its fullness. I'm keenly aware in this moment of the Advent candles glowing to my left. Advent, the season of waiting for the arrival of a certain baby, the nativity, the birth. We could quite naturally circle back to the concept of birth at this point in the sermon. Or you could circle back to your husband, said my husband. But I'll tell you what. In the gospel stories, after Jesus was born to a humble family in the humblest of places, on a day we celebrate as Christmas, awe is already the predominant response. Shepherds in the fields are met by angels, and they tremble as they are surrounded by angelic singing. Magi from the east, Zoroastrian priests, gazing at the night sky, follow a particular star for many miles to arrive at his side. In this time and place, we've transformed that story into a whole month, interwoven or layered culturally with other stories and traditions for maximum awe. In December, we celebrate solstice and Hanukkah and a magical, benevolent, grandfatherly figure delivering gifts to children around the globe in a single night. And so my parting advice to you this morning is to make time for what leaves you silenced, what shifts your way of thinking, and fills you with wonder. Plan that visit, that view, or that listening time for whatever is awe-inspiring to you. And although it may not fit in a stocking, like not even Carl's stocking, if you share it with somebody else, that would probably be one of the best gifts of all. Let's sing.